Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nope Nab Narp, and today I want to talk about Dark Souls. Well, I want to talk about Dark Souls every day, but today I want to focus in on comparing the world design of Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 3. Before you even ask, no, I will not be looking at the world design of Dark Souls 2 in this video, simply because I want to focus in on the games in which creative genius Hidetaka Miyazaki was the director. Well, not to mention that Drangleick's world design isn't well thought out. I mean, I'm probably the billionth person to point this out, but how the hell is Iron Keep floating invisibly in the sky above the Earthen Peak? Sorcery bullshit and developer oversights. That's how. Anyway, back to the real deals. Before we jump in, let me note that I did have to borrow footage of Dark Souls 1 gameplay because I don't have the capability of recording gameplay off my PlayStation 3 at this point. So I'm going to leave a link in the description to where I got the footage. Anyway, these games have been analyzed from just about every angle possible, from levels, atmosphere, equipment, lore, PvP, and so on and so forth. The world design is no different. A lot of fans of the Souls series view Dark Souls 1 as the pinnacle of world building and argue that each subsequent release hasn't been able to capture that same level of magic. Today, I want to challenge that belief and argue that the world of Dark Souls 3 is more believable, better thought out, and more comparable to real life than that of Dark Souls. A lot of great YouTubers who have spent much more time than me studying the Souls series have commented on how the world of Dark Souls 1 is strengthened not only because the areas are interconnected, but also because of its sheer verticality. And they're exactly right. I mean, think about it. The world is kind of built like a sandwich, as you can see from this excellent rendition of Lordran. It goes up and it goes down and features very few sections that have the player moving horizontally for a large period of time. You start at Firelink Shrine and go up to the Undead Burg, and up to the Undead Parish, and up within Sen's Fortress, and up to Anor Londo, and hell, even up to the Duke's Archives. On the other hand, you also move down to the New Londo Ruins, to the Depths, to Blighttown, to the Catacombs, to the Tomb of Giants, and so on and so forth. This vertical movement also occurs in areas that are condensed in terms of being set on a horizontal grid. Obviously, you can only walk horizontally, but the levels themselves are designed with verticality at the forefront, making the world feel very dense. Even within these levels, there's a heavy emphasis on moving vertically. Think of Blighttown, or the Undead Burg, or even the Duke's Archives. Hell, I'd say the only levels in which verticality isn't the emphasis are the Valley of Drakes and Lost Izalith. To be honest with you, Lordran's design is excellent. It so greatly mirrors what the game wants the player to experience, a series of peaks and valleys. Valleys, of course, being those times when you just keep dying over and over again, but the peaks, oh man, they come oh so sweet after beating that boss that pounded your skull in 73 times in a row. The world design matches that theme perfectly, as you are constantly traveling up and down and experiencing relentless frustration, followed by an admirable sense of accomplishment. It's a good, natural flow. And this emphasis on verticality is something that I haven't really experienced in other games, whether they're similar to Dark Souls or not. I mean, think about it. Games like Grand Theft Auto 5, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, and Skyrim all have mountains and valleys, but they're spread out over a huge, massive horizontal plane. The verticality in Dark Souls is unique, at least to any game I've ever played, and I think that's what has people saying that the world design peaked in the first installment of the Souls series. But I believe there's a difference between calling a game's world fun and unique versus calling it believable, at least in terms of its geographical design. You can argue that the world of Dark Souls is more fun to experience and explore, but that's completely subjective, and what we're focusing in on here is how believable the world design actually is. Lordran is a sandwich, and while it remains a fan favorite in the series, it isn't the most immersive in terms of pure world design. For example, I can never understand how Ash Lake is below Blighttown. I can't wrap my mind around it. How can those trees be growing under a swamp? To me, that's as egregious as the Iron Keep mishap in Dark Souls 2. But, let's move on. So how could Lordran be called the most believable world in the series when Lothric is designed to not only feel connected, but also realistic? There's no argument, Lordran is more interconnected than Lothric, but does that necessarily make it more realistic? No. More fun? Perhaps, but more on that later. In terms of pure believability, I would argue that Lothric is better thought out and has a better grip on geography than its earlier predecessor. Upon its announcement and initial release, a lot of hype was placed on Dark Souls 3, with creative mastermind Miyazaki returning to lead the charge. Many fans of the series hoped that the world would be built similar to that of Dark Souls, with an emphasis on verticality and interconnectedness. But Miyazaki wanted something different this time. And it's kind of clear from reading interviews with the guy that he doesn't like to dwell on one thing for a long period of time. He likes to start a project, finish it, and move on to the next thing. It's a big reason why he took up the helm in developing Bloodborne while letting other members of the team develop Dark Souls 2. But he returned to the beloved franchise to send off the series right in Dark Souls 3, and this time, the world would be different. A lot of fans were disappointed to see that the world of Lothric was much more linear than that of Dark Souls, and wrote that aspect of the game off quite quickly. In Dark Souls, upon arriving to Lordran, you can go to many different places with or without the Master Key, and your first boss encounter could be a fight with one of 7 different enemies. In Dark Souls 3, after you first arrive in Lothric, there's only one of 2 ways to go, and only 2 bosses to face first, that being Vort of the Boreal Valley, or the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. This set the pace for how Dark Souls 3 would be different from its first installment in terms of its world design. But Lothric finds its own ways to give the players options on where to go next. I just mentioned the option of fighting either Vort or the Dancer first, but later on you can choose to go to the Cathedral of the Deep or into Farron Keep first, and even later than that, you can choose to go up to Anor Londo or down to the Profane Capital first. As you can see, options on where to go next still exist within the world, but they just aren't as plentiful as they were in Lordran. It represents a compromise between world believability and allowing for player freedom. Many have described the third game in the series as being too linear and horizontal, arguing that the emphasis on verticality had been removed, making the world feel lesser than that of Dark Souls. But think about it, that isn't completely true. There is still a lot of vertical movement within Lothric. It just isn't all stacked up on each other like a sandwich. Instead, it's spread out across a large horizontal plane. You start in Lothric and make your way down to the Undead Settlement, and then down to the Farron Keep, and then down to the Catacombs of Karthus, and then down to Irithyll. Upon returning to Lothric Castle, you begin climbing up the castle and up to the archives and so on and so forth. The sense of verticality is still there, you, as the player, just don't notice it quite as much because it's more spread out horizontally and because the up and down movements aren't always so drastic. For example, the Road of Sacrifices feels super linear and horizontal, but there is a slight decline as you move from the beginning of the area to the second bonfire near Henri and Horus, and then further down into the swamp. The verticality is there, it just isn't as dramatic as, say, moving downward in Blighttown. And just like in Dark Souls 1, the levels themselves in Dark Souls 3 also contain a decent amount of verticality in their design. Areas like the High Wall of Lothric, the Grand Archives, and Irithyll/Anor Londo all contain many staircases, ladders, and drop-downs that pay homage to the verticality of the first game. It is my belief that Miyazaki simply wanted Lothric to feel more like an actual landmass by spreading its areas across a larger horizontal space. This balance between vertical and horizontal movement across the map results in Lothric being a more believable world overall, comparable to a cliffside that overlooks a large valley. The cliffside, of course, representing Lothric Castle, and the valley representing everything else. For me, this world feels more believable despite being less interconnected, because having the levels stretched out over an entire landscape is more akin to our real world. It feels like a place that could easily exist on Earth, and so I buy into it more. I'd say the only part of the world that I think could have been designed better is the transition into Farron Keep. A giant ladder going straight down just doesn't do it for me, and it feels super forced and very uninspired. Besides that though, like I said, in terms of designing a geographically sound world, I think Miyazaki and his team perfected their craft in designing Lothric. But does that mean that Lothric is more enjoyable to explore than Lordran? Well, of course that's an incredibly subjective concept, but I would argue it comes down to what you're looking for more in a game. Some of you may be thinking, who gives a rat's ass if the world is believable, if it isn't as fun? Well, as someone who is certified to teach geography and enjoys studying it, I would say me. And I don't mean to say that the world of Lordran isn't believable, because it certainly feels like a place that could have existed outside of its geography. I just think that Lothric is designed in a way that more intelligently compromises between realism and the liberties of designing a fantasy game world. I think fans of the series would call Lothric a better world than Lordran if it had included one key component that the latter had within its world. Those moments where you take an elevator back somewhere and think, oh shit, I can't believe this led back to here. It's that moment when you're riding down from the Undead Parish, you step out of the elevator and realize you're back at Firelink Shrine. It's incredible, and Lothric misses out on this opportunity because of its emphasis on a more horizontal world. I'd say the only comparable moment to that in Dark Souls 3 is when you keep returning to the same bonfire within the Cathedral of the Deep. If Miyazaki had found a way to include more of these types of moments, perhaps more people would side with me on this one. In the end, I may find Lothric to be a more believable world in terms of its world design, but when analyzing these two things, you can't overlook the impact of the sheer amount of freedom offered to the player from the very beginning in Lordran. Like I said, it comes down to what you look for more in the game, player freedom or believability. And now it's time for you to tell me what your opinion is down in the comments below. Lothric, Lordran, which is your favorite and why? Which world do you think is better designed? As always, thank you for watching. Please leave a like on the video if you enjoyed, subscribe for more, and as always, have a great day and take care.